Today, in joint collaboration, these two hallmark organizations proudly welcome the Honorable Will A. Gunn as the first speaker in BLSA's L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series. The L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series features notable and respected individuals who have served in governmental, public policy, and legal capacities, and who have made significant contributions to the nation, our Commonwealth, the law school, and our community. Selected speakers embody the ideals of public and community service Governor Wilder has represented throughout his distinguished career as a public servant. Although the governor could not join us today, he sends his warm regards to the William & Mary community. With that said, at this time I would like to call Mr. Xavier Jefferson forward to read a BLSA proclamation recognizing Colonel Gunn as the first distinguished speaker in the 2014-2015 L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series. Mr. Jefferson. Will everyone please stand?
A proclamation. Whereas the W.C. Jefferson chapter of the Black Law Students Association at the Marshall Woods School of Law at the College of William & Mary in Virginia calls upon well-respected individuals who have served in governmental, public policy, and legal capacities, and who have made significant contributions to the nation, the Commonwealth, and or the local community. And whereas the Honorable Will A. Gunn served with great distinction in the United States Air Force for 25 years and retired at the rank of colonel, and as the first ever Chief Defense Counsel in the Department of Defense Office of Military Commissions. And whereas Colonel Gunn's congeniality, generosity, and forward-thinking intellect guided him as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Washington and as founder and principal of the Gunn Law Firm, which provided representation to the nation's military members and veterans. And whereas in 2014, the W.C. Jefferson chapter of the Black Law Students Association commences the L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series. Now, therefore, I, Matthew C. Kimlick, President of the W.C. Jefferson chapter of the Black Law Students Association, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution of the W.C. Jefferson chapter of the Black Law Students Association, do hereby proclaim October 30th, 2014, as the beginning of the William & Mary Black Law Students Association L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series, and do hereby proclaim the Honorable Will A. Gunn, Colonel United States Air Force retired, as the first speaker in the William & Mary Black Law Students Association L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series. In witness whereof I hereunto set my hand this 30th day of October in the year of our Lord 2014, signed Matthew C. Kimlick, President, Eduardo L. Lopez, Secretary.
Everyone may now be seated. Thank you, Xavier. It is now my high privilege and distinct honor to present to you our Dean, Dr. Davison Douglas, to introduce our distinguished guest of honor.
Matthew, thank you so much. What a wonderful day this is, long in coming. And I have to begin with a personal story. It was a couple of years ago. I was attending a special event, Virginia Law Foundation, and they had a remarkable keynote speaker. It was one of the most inspirational talks I had heard in a long time. And I went up to the speaker afterwards and I said, I'd love to have you come to speak at William & Mary Law School, and today that wish is being fulfilled. I am so pleased to have with us Colonel Gunn, Colonel Will Gunn. You heard a lot in that reading about his biography. I will say this, we prize the tradition of the citizen lawyer at this law school. And Colonel Gunn is a citizen lawyer, a graduate of the Air Force Academy, Harvard Law School, 25-year career in the Air Force, General Counsel to the Veterans Administration. While in the Air Force, he also supervised all defense activities of the detainees at Guantanamo Bay. He served as CEO of Boys and Girls Club in Washington, D.C. He's had an extraordinary career, and Colonel Gunn, we are so delighted to have you with us here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Dean, thank you very, very much for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone for attending today. BLSA and Matthew, I wanted to thank you for the proclamation. And Bellama, I thank you for recommending that I be here today and be the. I didn't realize when you invited me that I would be the first person in this speaker series, but considering that Governor Wilder is an inspiration of mine, I'm indeed honored by that. Again, I greatly appreciate it. I'm glad, Professor Roberts, that you're here today. We have collaborated in the past, and I think I'll get a chance to talk about that just a tad while I'm here. And so, what I wanted to do today, the title, Cauldron Leadership, from Guantanamo to Veterans Affairs, Adversity, Leadership, and Impact. I've done some thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about today. But as I was telling some of the folks just a little while ago over lunch, I'm a bit inspired by being here because of the fact that my first visit to Williamsburg was almost 50 years ago. And I was a child, a young child, and at that time my parents took a trip up the eastern seaboard during the late 1960s. And I got to Williamsburg and I learned something about this ideal of the citizen lawyer. And I was inspired by it. In fact, as I did the tour of Colonial Williamsburg and heard the stories about how many of the founders had careers in the law, I was inspired by that because, you see, I've always been a generalist. I've always been drawn to public service. And the idea that as a lawyer, you can do all of these different things, that resonated with me. And so it's a special treat to be here at William & Mary Law School. But what I wanted to do is, before I have some slides for you, but I don't want to be distracted by the slides. What I want to do instead is that I'd really like to just share a story with you, a pivotal story for me, a critical moment in my life. And my critical moment goes back more than a dozen years, like for many of you. How many of you, and I'm just testing a theory here, but how many of you can remember exactly where you were and what you were doing when you heard that a jet had hit the World Trade Center? Unanimous. Okay. Well, I want to share what I was doing. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I was in Washington, D.C. I just got into town a couple of months before. I was an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. I had what's called a line number for Colonel. I've been selected for promotion, and I was living large. I was tremendously excited. My finances were going in the right direction after renting out a house at a negative cash flow for many years. And now I'd moved back into that house and I had surplus for the first time in a long time. And so I was enjoying that. Plus I was a student at what's called National Defense University, which is located on Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. And Fort McNair is located at a beautiful spot in the city. It's located at the intersection of where the Anacostia River meets the Potomac River. From one point you can look and you can see Wilson Bridge, you can see Haynes Point, you can see the United States Capitol, and it is absolutely beautiful. And so I was a student there. I've been selected for what's called Senior Service School. And for 9 months, my job was just to go to school. And I had my regular salary, and I had a number of perks along with this assignment. So I was enjoying what I was doing. On this one morning, I was involved in a seminar discussion. A seminar was about 12 people, and I was in a military studies class. and we were having a discussion. I don't remember exactly what that discussion involved, but my instructor came into the room, and he said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And that disrupted our flow for a moment, but it wasn't the first time that a plane had hit a large building in New York City, so that really wasn't all that spectacular. But then just a few minutes later, he came back into the room and he said that another plane had hit the World Trade Center, and this time it was the other tower, and it wasn't a plane, it was actually a jet, and a jet had also hit the first tower. And so from that point on, we knew that the world had changed, and that there was an entirely different dynamic going on. And so like many folks, we crowded around televisions and such, and the rest of the day largely is a blur, except what I can remember is going along 395 South later that afternoon when they allowed us to go down and we could see the Pentagon burning and could smell the smell of all the various chemicals and such coming from that building. And all of a sudden we've gone from peacetime to wartime. I want to fast forward. The school that I was attending at National Defense University was called the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and is now called the Eisenhower School. But at that particular time, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, the focus really hasn't changed. Part of the way that they get military members and senior civilians to start thinking about strategic issues, how the government it impacts society, how you take concepts and you use those concepts in order to implement policy. That was the mission of the school. And one of the ways they did that was by studying industrial policies. And the class was divided up into various industry studies. And at the end of your first semester, you get to choose which industry you're going to go in. At least you get to make a bid. And if you get the bid that you've put in, then you get your choice. Well, the choice that I had, I got my first choice, and I wanted to study agribusiness. It wasn't so much that I wanted to study agribusiness, but you see one of the fringe benefits of the program was that you got a chance to be involved in international travel. And the trip that agribusiness would go on would be a trip to Cape Town, South Africa, and flying across the Atlantic to Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'd never been to South America, and I'd never been to South Africa. It seemed like a perfect opportunity to study agribusiness in these two great locations. So I was in agribusiness. I'd just spent a week in Cape Town. This was May of 2002. And then I'd flown over to Buenos Aires, and in Buenos Aires, again, everything was going my way. You see, the Argentine currency had been pegged to the dollar. But then in December of 2001, the Argentine currency, Argentine economy, as it's been apt to do many times, had a meltdown. And so what had been pegged 1-to-1 to the dollar was now going 3-to-1. But the prices were the same. So in other words, something that had cost $300 was now only costing $100. And you see, I came armed to Argentina with my shopping list. And so I had various obligations there, factories to see, farms to tour, but I also had my shopping to do. And so after a hard day of touring and shopping, I went into an internet cafe to check my emails. And in this internet cafe, I come across an email from the Pentagon. And the email was from a Sergeant Jones. And Sergeant Jones was who was in the office of the DoD General Counsel. And Sergeant Jones said that Colonel Gunn, Mr. Whit Cobb, who is one of the Deputy DoD General Counsel, would like to interview you about becoming the Chief Defense Counsel. I looked at the email and I reread the email, not knowing what Sergeant Jones was talking about. I was really confused. And the reason for my confusion was that I'd come to that moment in time with a lot of things having gone on. After September 11th, you see, I was promoted to full colonel. In addition to that, my former boss, my first boss out of law school, who I'd worked for when he was a major, was now a major general. And he had been selected to become, he was serving as the Judge Advocate General. He was the #1 lawyer in the Air Force. Not only that, he had asked me at Christmas time if I would be willing to serve as his executive officer. So, how many military folks do we have? Veterans or serving in the military now? Okay. And so, military folks can tell you that being an executive officer or being an aide to a general officer can be a big deal. As a colonel, being an executive officer, what it meant in JAG was that they were giving me an opportunity to compete, to perhaps wear a star. In fact, this wasn't even subtle. I've been told as much. Colonel Will sent you to senior service school, want to bring you back in, put you in the front office, so you get an opportunity to see how things are going. And because one day, I think you have what it takes to perhaps lead this department. That's what I have been told. And so I was very much excited about having that job as my follow-on to senior service school. But now, I'm reading this email saying that they want to interview me to become the Chief Defense Counsel. I didn't even know the Department of Defense had a Chief Defense Counsel's job. But since I was out of the country, I responded, and I let the writer know that I was out of the country, I'd be back in a few days, I'd be happy to talk when I got back. And then I sought out to find out what in the world was going on. I called my wife, and she told me she had gotten a call from the Pentagon that day, and that it was the Deputy Judge Advocate General, and he wanted to talk to me. And I told her about my email. And I told her that, I don't know what this is all about, but, the president back in November, he authorized these military commissions. And it's possible that what's going on is that they're looking for someone to serve as the Chief Defense Counsel for these military commissions. My wife was not happy. She wasn't happy because she was getting comfortable with the idea of me working in the Pentagon as the executive officer to the Judge Advocate General. She liked that idea. She saw the promotion potential with respect to that idea. The idea, though, of going and working as the chief representative for members of Al-Qaeda didn't seem like the greatest career prospects for me or for her. And so we were concerned. When I reached out to the general, I found out that yes, indeed, that's exactly what had happened, that I'd been nominated to become the Chief Defense Counsel for the Office of Military Commissions, this newly constructed office. This office, in fact, that hadn't been constructed at all, that they were getting ready to put together. And so I didn't know what to do. I reached out to various people that I knew, because I found out I had about a week or two before I'd actually have to go for the interview. And I got a range of feedback from people that I talked to. But most of that feedback landed squarely in two camps. One camp was, I don't know. The other camp, and the far more prevalent camp, was, run away from it as fast as you possibly can. As one of my instructors at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces explained to me, he said, Will, this is a setup. You see, if you do a good job and you zealously represent the detainees, there are going to be people in the military that are not going to forgive you, that are going to question your loyalty, and you're not going to be able to win. On the other hand, if you don't do a good job, how are you going to live with yourself? I got that feedback from several people. I talked to my parents. I talked to my pastor. I prayed about it. And then finally, I got a chance to talk to somebody that I really wanted to talk to. And that was the Judge Advocate General, because it turns out he was the one that had put my name in. So I had this question in the back of my mind, not just in the back, but in the forefront. This person who had been a mentor of mine for years, who had asked me to come and serve as his executive officer, basically his chief of staff, he had somehow nominated me for this job. So what was that all about? In other words, had I done something to get him mad, to upset him? What was happening? And I had a good conversation with him. He said, look, we nominated someone from another job to the Department of Defense General Counsel, and that person went in and they basically threw the interview. They said, I don't know why I've been nominated, because if I'm selected, I'm just going to get out. I'm not a volunteer for this position. So he was told that if you're going to nominate somebody, you need to nominate legitimate candidates. And he also told me that, Will, I look at your background, I look at the opportunities that you've been given, and I just think you could do a good job in that role. I thanked him for that feedback and for having confidence in me. But I told him, I said, sir, my concern is that there are going to be people that won't be able to understand how I can possibly do the job. He said, well, I understand, and you're probably right. But I tell you what, I still want to give you an opportunity to compete for promotion. I still want you to come work for me. And because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the position open for you. And so if you're selected, I only want you to work in that job for a year. And then I'm going to want you to come back and work for me. I told him I really appreciated it. And he told me something else. And he said, and by the way, if you really don't want the job, I wouldn't have a problem and would not hold it against you if you threw the interview. There are times that you're confronted with situations where you know it's a test. I knew that was a test. Whether he intended it as such or not, he offered me an option that I could not possibly accept. I couldn't accept it from the standpoint from my personal integrity, and I couldn't accept it from the standpoint of we had soldiers that were in harm's way, and the only thing that was being asked of me was to be put in a position that was perhaps unpopular, perhaps put my career at risk. But that's a small price. So I told him as much. I said, sir, I appreciate that, but I can't do that. I went for the interview. The interview went well, and it came down to a crucial point. At one point, Mr. Cobb asked me, so Colonel Gunn, are you a volunteer for this position? When I was a small kid growing up in South Florida, it was Memorial Day, my 5th grade year. We were out on the beach, and the beach where we were was very close to the Intercoastal Waterway. And I got into a portion of the Intercoastal Waterway, and I wasn't a very strong swimmer, and I was just standing up, and I stepped down into a depression, and I found myself drowning. And you know, it really is true that when you sense that you're drowning, that you have all kinds of thoughts, and your life is flashing before your eyes. And at that point in that interview, my whole career started flashing before my eyes. And I told Mr. Cobb, I said, I believe I could do a good job in the role, but I don't want this to be my last job in uniform. Therefore, if I'm selected for the job, I wouldn't want to stay very long. He thanked me for that, and we moved forward. And he told me that the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, he would likely want to meet with key candidates for the top jobs, such as Chief Defense Counsel and Chief Prosecutor. And so he asked me what my schedule would be for the next couple of weeks, and I gave him my schedule, telling him that I was going to be around. I said, good. Appreciate this because everything is on a fast track right now. It's taken a while to get to this point, but it's on a fast track now. That was in the summer of 2002. In February 2003, I was offered the job of acting Chief Defense Counsel. So I found out, and I'm sure those of you in uniform can appreciate what fast track means in the military. It has a different meaning than it may mean in other sectors, in other segments. And so what I want to talk about is what that experience was all about and what other experiences that I've had have been about. And I want to do it by just sharing some thoughts with you. A cauldron is a situation of distress or unrest, felt to resemble a boiling kettle or a vat. In other words, it's hot. I was placed in a hot situation on the ground floor of the Pentagon in the wedge right next to where the plane had hit, where the jet had hit on the morning of September 11th. And each day, as I would go from my office to the restroom, I would pass by that newly constructed wedge and I would see a plaque on the wall. And the plaque were words that President Bush had spoken on the night of September 11th, 2001. And the plaque read, "Terrorists can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America." When you find yourself in a cauldron situation or a cauldron moment, it's going to be characterized by what some would call a VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And there was a lot of that in that particular role. There were new rules. The United States had not done any military commissions in almost 70 years. Since the end, well, at that time, about 60 years, since the end of World War II. So, brand new. How are we going to handle these? What are the rules going to be? It was complex and uncertain. What I want to talk about is this concept, effective cauldron leadership. Since I found myself in a leadership position, I was not given permission to represent any of the detainees. Instead, my job was to oversee the process, to oversee the lawyers, to make sure they had the resources that they needed, and to serve as a liaison. And so in that capacity, I wanted to be as effective as I possibly could because I knew that the people that I had working for me were going to find themselves, while things might feel hot for me, they were going to be even hotter for them. And so when I talk about effective cauldron leadership, effectiveness embodied within that concept is a degree of competence and also virtue or morality. Because a person can be an effective leader in some circles, but that doesn't mean that they care about anybody. That does not mean that they're abiding by any type of ethical principles. From my perspective, and for purposes of this presentation, that's what we're talking about, competence and virtue. I believe that effective cauldron leaders need to pursue passion and purpose. In fact, I would encourage people to pursue passion and purpose regardless of what it is that they're doing. Whatever they're doing, pursue it. And effective cauldron leaders are ones who enter the arena. In other words, they actually get involved. They actually take a risk. Not too long ago, the Roosevelt miniseries was on PBS. And they tracked the lives and careers of President Theodore Roosevelt, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was an amazing character, and one of my favorite quotes deals with the arena. And he said, "It is not the critic who counts, nor the man who points how the strong man stumbled, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.
Amen.
If you're going to be an effective call to leader, you have to take some chances. You're going to have to prioritize conviction over convenience. The one thing that I believe in this arena was that the war that we're involved in, which had been christened a global war on terrorism, wasn't going to be a traditional war. It wasn't going to be a war that was going to be gauged. Success was not going to be gauged based upon the bombs dropped on a target, nor on how much geography was gained. Instead, success would be gauged on the hearts and minds of people. We have a system that we hold up. The quote that I shared from President Bush when he talked about terrorists can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they can't touch the foundation of America. That's what you all are all here studying. The rule of law in this country. That is the foundation of America. And what I believe is that that conviction was a thing that needed to be preeminent. Thomas Paine, a great patriot, said that he who would have his own liberty secured must guard even his enemy from oppression. For if he forsakes that duty, he establishes a precedent that reaches to himself. John Adams, in his diary, he talks about how he defended Captain Thomas Preston following the Boston Massacre. John Adams, cousin of Samuel Adams, one of the great patriots, second president of the United States, defended the British after the Boston Massacre, who had been accused of killing at least 5 Americans. Why did he do it? He did it because he believed in these values that we hold up. And in retrospect, what he said was that he believed they were some of the best service he ever rendered to his country. We're going to have to prioritize conviction over convenience. You may have to embrace courage and reject convention. Embrace courage and reject convention. While I was in the job, I had one of my people got promoted. An Army major got promoted to lieutenant colonel. And we had an Army brigadier general come over. He was a JAG brigadier. And he shared a quote with me that has just resonated with me through the years. And the quote was by someone by the name of Ambrose Redmoon. And Ambrose Redmoon said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the belief that something else is more important than that fear. So that was self-assuring for me, because there were times during that year where, wow, I was very concerned about the future of my career. There were things that I wanted to do with respect to the Air Force, things that I wanted to do with respect to the military, and things after the military. But how were these activities that I was involved in, how were they going to be impacted? I was concerned by all of that. You have to be tied to your values. Tetherball, the reason I have tetherball up there is that when I was growing up in an elementary school, they had some tetherball poles on the playground. And in my neighborhood, of course, the goal of tetherball is to get that ball wrapped around the pole in the direction that you're hitting in, or the direction that you're throwing in. But in my elementary school, sometimes that ball will become untethered. And you have to chase the ball back, and you have to put it back on the hook in order to continue your game of tetherball. But the reality is, that pole wasn't going anywhere. Your values have to be like that pole. There have to be some things that have said, no, I'm not moving on this point. And it's a lot easier to do that, I believe, if you make that decision before you get to the pivotal moment. If you thought about it beforehand, as opposed to in the moment of crisis. Effective cauldron leaders listen. One of the first pivotal moments as the Chief Defense Counsel came several months after I was in the job. And members of my team, who I had selected, they came to me one day and said, and told me that there was a case pending before the Supreme Court, a case which became to be known as Rasul versus Bush. And Rasul versus Bush was brought on behalf of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. And they were taking the position that these, the alleged terrorists, the detainees, should be able to file writs of habeas corpus, and that the federal courts should be able to entertain those. But there was a precedent from the 1940s, a case called Eisentrager, which stood in the way. And so they were challenging Eisentrager, and the Supreme Court had granted cert. And so members of my team came and said, hey, sir, we've been talking to various folks around the country, the Constitutional Law Society and others, and what they'd like to do is help us with an amicus brief that will be filed on behalf of the defense counsel in this office. My response was, isn't there somebody else that could write the brief? I asked that question because I knew my chain of command wasn't going to be very pleased with this development of the defense counsel in the Department of Defense writing such a brief. So they said, well, sir, yeah, there are other people and arguments can be made, but because of other cases, such as the University of Michigan case on affirmative action, where former military officers had written an amicus brief, it's likely that the Supreme Court will take our brief and consider it and read it and pay attention because of who it is that's writing it. So we believe that it would have special impact. So I listened to what they had to say, and I invited them to make a formal presentation to me, present their case as to why they should be able to write the brief. And they invited in an advisor that they had, a gentleman by the name of Neil Keitel, who's on the faculty at Georgetown University Law School, who's also a former Assistant Solicitor General for the United States. Actually the very first person that reached out to me after I got the job. And they came in, and after listening, I was convinced that they were absolutely right, and that they should have permission to write the brief. So I asked them to write me a letter, and that I would hand deliver the letter through my chain of command to the General Counsel for the Department of Defense. And after feeling much as I felt when I was a freshman at the Air Force Academy, the lowest person on the totem pole, they eventually gave permission for that brief to be written. But it all came about as a result of listening to the people around me, listening to the people around me. Effective leaders set the tone, and they develop and communicate vision. One of the things that I found myself doing in this job was I traveled the country, I accepted speaking invitations all over the place, and I did that so that I could fight against a perception and so that people could understand what it was that we were doing. I went to a party one night, and I told a person there what my job was and what I was tasked with doing. And I was told that, I don't know why we're providing trials for those folks. We should just line them up and shoot them all. And while that was the only person while I had the job that told me that, I knew that the position that I was taking wasn't one that was universally popular. So it was important to develop and communicate vision. Prioritizing communications was critical. And if you're an effective cauldron leader, you have to be willing to make tough calls, tough decisions and hard calls, even though you're not going to have all the information that you want to have. Effective cauldron leaders admit and own their mistakes. I saw this most beautifully represented by former Attorney General Janet Reno back 20 years ago. In the aftermath of the siege in Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidian siege where about 76 people were killed, I saw Janet Reno on the news say that she took full responsibility for what had gone on. She made the call. She had given the FBI permission to launch a tear gas attack. And while she had no idea that all those people were going to die, she admitted it. She owned it. And unfortunately, that's rare. I'm thankful that the Department of Veterans Affairs the last few years, I worked for someone who was an effective cauldron leader, and that was former Secretary Eric Shinseki, who is truly an amazing leader. Leaders select and develop great people. Throughout the time of serving as Chief Defense Counsel, one thing that I did right, that I take some credit for, was selecting outstanding people. People that were going to be able to elevate their perception of what is the right thing to do over their career interests. As it turned out, about 50% of them got passed over for promotion. And so they knew they were taking a risk, but I think in the long run, I know in the long run, they delivered valuable service to the nation. Effective leaders share the credit. You can't do it alone, and if you try to take the credit, you're going to just alienate people. So if you can share it, then you benefit yourself tremendously. And finally, effective cauldron leaders do the right thing. Whatever the right thing may be. After taking the job as General Counsel, after being confirmed by the Senate, one of my first meetings with Secretary Shinseki concerning a significant issue was an issue concerning a rather small policy issue. We had a benefits program called the Vocational Rehabilitation Program. And under vocational rehabilitation, veterans who are eligible for that program could receive some pay through a work-study component. And for years, some veterans had worked on congressional staff. And this had been going on, and it seemed to be a win for the veterans, seemed to be a win for the congressional staffs, because these veterans would go in and they would help with constituent affairs. So they would handle matters such as when the congressman's office was contacted and the veteran who was contacting the office wanted to know the status of their benefits claim, then this veteran who was working work-study, they could run it down, contact the Department of Veterans Affairs, and find out what was going on. The only problem was, this was 180 degrees out from what the regulations allowed. But again, the congressman loved the program. And so someone finally asked for a general counsel opinion, and the opinion that I signed off on was one saying that what we've been doing is unlawful. We can probably allow people who currently enroll to continue to the end of the semester, but then we need to stop it. I went to see the boss along with our Assistant Secretary for Congressional and Legislative Affairs, and the boss said something profound. He said, I have to abide by the law. Why was that profound? Because we'd already gotten calls from various congressmen telling them that we were going to be reducing their staff by by the share that was represented by this unpaid labor, this free labor that they were getting. And actually got a call myself from a congressman who was unhappy with that prospect. But when I found that I was working for a boss, for a leader that made his top priority doing the right thing, it made my job so much easier. it's hard to know when a cauldron will arise or intensify. I served at the Department of Veterans Affairs for about 61 months. And I tell folks that about 59 of those months was incredible. Very, very pleasant. The last couple, not so much. But you never know. So you cannot find yourself in a position where you're just going to wait and say, things are intensifying, therefore I'm in the midst of it now, so I need to start instituting some of these concepts. Concepts that I've talked about, I encourage you to apply at any time. Make an impact by probing the possible. Professor Roberts, when we met in D.C., I think it was in Senator Warner's office, you were pitching the idea of the Puller Clinic. How can the Puller Clinic play a greater role in expanding this concept of law students doing more to help veterans? And there are a lot of lawyers. One of the things that you're trained to do as in law school, you can look at it from the standpoint of you're trained to say no. But you're also trained to look at the possible. What are the possibilities? And I had people on my team and on my staff while at VA that were very adept at that when they were given the freedom to start looking at what's possible. As a result of that, we were able to do some incredible things. We increased the number of veterans treatment courts from just a handful to, when I checked last week, over 260 in less than 5 years' time. When I got to VA, there was one location in the country that had a pro bono legal clinic for veterans on a VA facility. Now there are more than 60 of these. Why? Because I had a guy on my staff named Bill Russo that looked around and said, there's some authority here where we could make some free space available. And there are plenty of organizations that want to provide services to veterans. Why don't we merge the two? We did that. He wrote a directive for the VA, and as a result of that, by probing the possible, we were able to make an impact. And that's a lasting legacy. Last spring, we worked with William & Mary to have a Veterans Law Forum to talk to private groups about how they could go and serve veterans. And then the next day, William & Mary had a conference as well. Working together, probing the possible, you can do incredible things. So I encourage all of you, regardless of what you may be doing, where you are, dare to lead. I've talked about leadership today because leadership is something that I'm absolutely passionate about. I believe that it's critical. It's something that flows into every aspect of your life, and it's not a function of position. It's not a function of title. It's a function of attitude, and it is a function of action. What you're prepared to do. I have a son, my middle son, who's in his mid-20s right now, and he's been very concerned about the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and he started to look at issues around the country. And so what I keep telling him is, okay, what are you going to do? What impact are you going to make? And so we all need to think in terms of what difference are we going to make? And in order to do that, you have to risk. Let me close by just sharing this. From an anonymous author, part of a poem that I like called Dare to Risk, which you can find on the web. I'll just share part of it. Risk must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The people who risk nothing, do nothing, have nothing, are nothing. They avoid suffering and sorrow, but they cannot learn, change, grow, love, live. Chained by their attitudes, they are slaves. They have forfeited their freedom. Only a person who risks is free. Thanks. understand we have time for some questions. Yes.
I'm taking international criminal law right now, and one of the things we discussed was how there was some issues, international law issues related to POW treatment for detainees. How did your office handle that? And if you could expand on that.
Well, in the days after September 11th, and when we went into Afghanistan and started to take prisoners, there was a decision made at the highest levels of government that the people that were being detained were not entitled to prisoner of war treatment. Here are such things as this was a different type of war. These were non-traditional combatants, therefore they did not merit the protections under the Geneva Conventions. And so one of the first things that we had to do in bringing these folks together, my team, was to look at the Geneva Conventions, to look at the rules. We weren't convinced that that decision was a just decision. As it turned out, the Supreme Court eventually agreed with us in a case, Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, that they ruled that the military commissions that were established were not established consistent with the requirements of the Geneva Conventions. There's something on the Geneva Conventions called the Article 5 Tribunal, where when you collect someone on the battlefield, you're supposed to have an inquiry to determine whether or not they are entitled to POW status, if there's any doubt whatsoever. Well, our government decided that we weren't going to do that, and that was just a blanket decision. And while you could make a strong argument that members of Al-Qaeda were not entitled to POW treatment, members of the Taliban, that's a different story. So we looked at the issue, and eventually, of course, the Hamdan decision, the Hamdan case, came out of was brought by one of the people in my office on my team, Commander Charlie Swift. Yes.
Sort of then moving forward and dealing with something like ISIS, okay? Whether we pursue or not.
Yes.
From a legal standpoint, do you think that it's changed how DOD frames with them, quote, claiming territory and whatnot under Geneva? How do you then frame a combatant from a non-combatant in determining that Article 5?
Well, the Geneva Conventions has distinct rules, which I think are applicable, because a person can be we were using the term enemy combatant. A person can be a combatant and a lawful combatant, or they can be an unlawful combatant. And I think that's really the paradigm. So, in determining whether or not a person is a lawful combatant, you look at such things as are they a representative of a assignee? Are they in uniform? Do they have distinct insignia and such? So that it's clear. And so I think that there are sufficient guidelines within Article 5 and within the Geneva Conventions that the new conflict that we have with ISIS, we don't need to invent new law. I think the law is already there. We just have to apply it and not be intimidated because of the things that our enemies are doing.
At this time, we're going to close the floor for questions. So we thank you, Colonel Gunn, for coming today. At this time, I'd like to call for the BLSA Executive Board as well as Professor Roberts. Colonel Gunn, thank you for coming today. And on behalf of BLSA, we would like to give you a token of our gratitude. It says, from William and Mary Black Law Students Association, honors the Honorable Will A. Gunn as a distinguished speaker in the 2014-2015 L. Douglas Wilder Speaker Series, October 30th, 2014. Thank you. Appreciate it.
On behalf of the Lewis B. Puller Jr. Veterans Benefits Clinic, we would like to offer you our challenge coin, which on one side I think has 3 terms that certainly exemplify your career: selfless service, professionalism, and heroism. And we thank you for all that you did for veterans of our nation and for serving our country and for what you've helped us do in the Puller Clinic.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. Colonel Gunn will be in the rare book room from 2 to 2:30 to answer any questions you may have. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for the Puller Clinic for all of your help, as well as our symposium committee members. Bellama, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.